Hi everyone, welcome to this session on the key features of Techcello SaaS framework. We are going to run through a set of features, some of the very important features of Techcello framework, and we'll try to show you a demonstration of how these features can be leveraged, can be used while building your SaaS solution. So to start with, let's first try to understand how do you kind of get your product organized. So basically products are constituting of modules, and each module may contain a set of features in it. So the first thing we would like to do is to organize those modules and features in such way that it can be understood by the Techcello SaaS framework, and further on you can use those modules and features to create packages and apply other privilege and access control settings to it. So let's quickly look at the Visual Studio that will show us how a developer should typically be utilizing the Fluent API to register their module and features. So as you see here, we have a piece of code which adds a module SMS, and then you also see a set of features added to it. Along with that, the privileges that are associated with that feature. So when Techcello SaaS framework is used and you develop a solution on top of it, when you compile and when you build the solution, the Techcello SaaS framework will automatically read these configuration details, and it automatically will recognize and register the various modules, features, and privileges. And that's how the framework recognizes your product and further on allows you to do the configuration on top of it. So let's go ahead and try defining set of packages. Package basically indicates a set of modules that you want to combine together and offer it as a package to your end customers. So typically products usually have variants like a lighter version of your product, or it could be like a gold package, a platinum package, each representing the gamut of modules that it can provide or can come up with. So this is the page where you can go ahead and define the packages, and as you could see, the module list here shows all the modules of the Techcello SaaS framework, plus also the modules that could come from your own application. So what you see here is the phone support, the highlighted one, is actually coming from the functionality. So it's one of the modules that has been developed, as you could see here. The phone support module being developed on top of Techcello SaaS framework, but still it is coming under the list of modules. So you can go ahead and select these various options. And as you do the selection, so you could go ahead and pick and choose whichever ones you want, and then you can give a name to the package. And as you do this, this constitutes different sections under which you can classify the privileges and the modules. So once you're done with this, there is also something called assignable modules. So this assignable modules feature comes into play when you are dealing with tenant hierarchy kind of scenarios. Tenant hierarchy, we'll look at it in greater detail down the line in this session, but then just for a quicker understanding, it's basically the provision to create tenants and then the ability to create subtenants to it or child tenants to it, and further on the tree can keep growing to n level. So when you do something like that, the assignable modules and the assigned modules, they represent two things. Assigned modules represent the privileges or modules that you can use, whereas assignable modules indicate the modules that you cannot use, but then you can give it to your child tenants. So that way you have two things, two set of access to you. One, that you can kind of use it as well as you can enjoy the functionality. The other one, assignable modules, is something that you can provide those access, or that subset of modules can be handed over to the child tenants. Now there is also there is no connection between these assigned modules and assignable modules. That gives you more flexibility. which means the assignable modules need not be necessarily a subset of your assigned modules. In other words, I can pick to use some 5 modules, whereas I can pick and choose different 5 modules to be given to my child tenant. So that is also possible over here. So let's finish this creation of a premium package. So basically I have selected almost all the modules that are available. And let's quickly also go ahead and create tenant. The tenant, as we saw during the last session, it represents a customer. So this is a tenant management module that comes as out-of-box functionality from Techcello SaaS. You can go ahead and create a tenant. So we are creating a tenant called Pepsi Global. So let's assume that this is the overall global Pepsi tenant or a Pepsi organization that is planning to use this product. So we are naming it as Pepsi Global. So that when we deal with the tenant hierarchy, we will try to create more specific branches of this Pepsi, and then we can see how the tenant hierarchy kind of helps us. So let's fill in some of the basic details over here. And as you could see, there are various sections here: billing address, contact details, and so on. There is also a flexibility where you can have, the developers can actually code and bring a different section if there is a need. They can now just create a separate user control and they can plug in into this. That way you can capture additional information, or you could also use the custom fields, extended fields, which we'll see later, to capture some additional information beyond what is given here. And here we go. So we have the premium package showing up in the package list, which is what we created now. And alternatively, you can also, in addition to this, you can also specify the number of users that can be created by this tenant under the package that you are providing to them. So we are pretty much done. So let's go ahead and create this tenant. So we have successfully created, and it also shows something like tenant approved automatically. We'll come back to that because there are some features which can allow you to control this approval mechanism. We'll deal with it shortly. But before that, let's try to understand something called the settings templates. So typically what happens when it comes to tenant management is a lot of settings are configured as per a particular tenant. So generally when you want to create a category of tenants, ideally you don't want to repeat the job of setting off each of those settings manually. So ideally you could do, what you could do is to create a template, a settings template, which basically can capture all the setting related values and can be stored as a template, and later on whenever you create a tenant, you can associate a particular template to the tenant. That way they get all the settings in one shot. So it saves you a lot of time, and as well as it cuts down any manual errors and so on. So what we see here are the various attributes that are possible to be set as the settings for a given tenant. So there are some of the settings which we will go through. So there are quite a few, so we'll pick up some of the key things for today. And we'll start with this type. So one is the name of the template itself. So you can give a name to it. And the type indicates there are two types. You can create a fixed or a customized. So what this means is you as a parent tenant can determine whether the template that I'm going to set, the values present in the template, should or should not be changed by the child tenant. Because in some cases what might happen is you set some default values here, and then you give it to your child tenant and ask your child tenant to go and change it as per their wish. That is possible. Or alternatively, you want to fix certain configuration settings and you don't want the child tenant to override it. You just want the child tenant to consume it as it is. So those are the two categories of templates you can create. So fixed indicates that the child cannot change any of these values, and customized indicates that the child tenant can go ahead and modify these values. So what we see here in the bottom section are the set of attributes. Now each attribute represents a different piece of functionality. So we'll come back to that a bit later as we deal with some of these properties during the later part of the demo. So what we see here is the in the user management screen is the default product admin user, which is coming along with the SaaS framework. Now there is something called a tenant stratification concept. So tenant stratification in simpler terms indicates the list of tenants that a user or a role can have access to. So here we are looking at a role tenant admin, which represents the tenant admin of a particular tenant, and what we are seeing here is the mapping of various tenants to this particular role. So you can see a set of checkboxes, like for example Best Buy, and then you have Lorenzo, and then you have Best Buy Seattle, IBM, Pepsi Global. So there are some of the items checked over here and some are unchecked. So basically the checked ones are the tenants to which this particular user admin at company.com has access to. So he can kind of log in into that particular tenant and he can try to impersonate, or he can try to act like on behalf of kind of a scenario. And how do you do this? How do you get into these one of the tenants? You can use something called the session context. So you can see an icon over here right next to the welcome message. So on clicking that icon, you see a drop down here which basically shows all the tenants that we saw checked in the previous screen. So the moment this particular user decides to get into, say, Pepsi Global, all you need to do is select it and then give set session tenant. So you could see in the top bar after the welcome message, you see another message information stating session tenant is Pepsi Global. So while this user belongs to the product admin, while that is primary tenant, but right now he is operating under the context of a particular tenant. He is in the session of a particular tenant, and that tenant is the Pepsi Global. So that is how you can switch between multiple tenants when a user has access to more than one tenant. This scenario is pretty much useful in service lines kind of business areas where you may want to have one user or one agent servicing multiple tenants, or you want one common user to have access to various tenants. So this is a very easy way of switching back and forth into multiple tenants and then being able to operate without any hassle. So with that, we will move to the user and role creation, role management part. So user management is basically organizing all the users that can be created in a particular tenant. And as you create a user, you can also go ahead and define the roles for them. You can add any number of roles. And when it comes to roles, it can be done in whichever way you want. It could be just a one-to-one, which means one user mapped to one role, or it could be many-to-one where you can have multiple roles being assigned to the same person, or vice versa, the same role can be assigned to multiple users as well. So it's up to the business requirement of the product. You can create those roles and associate them to the users. And once you have those roles, the roles itself are not making any sense. So what makes sense out of them is the privileges that they bring along with them. And as you can see, this is the manage privilege screen, and we are in the role called sales manager. And you can select by module, or you can select all. And as you do the selection, you can see two boxes down, one available privileges, which will show you all the available privileges under the given module. So configuration module has so many privileges, and whichever ones you would like to add or give to the sales manager, you can select those and give add, and you can see it is populated in the box on the right hand side. So the right hand side indicates the privileges that the sales manager can do on this particular role. So let's go ahead and try to add a new user. So there we are done with the user creation. So we have created a new user, John Adams. The next thing is I am going to mark him as performing the role of sales manager, which inherently brings him or gives him the privileges that I have associated with that role. If you quickly look at the user screen, there are some common operations that you can also do as part of the user management. Like for example, you can lock all the users in one shot, so that you want to kind of deactivate that particular tenant. You could have facilities to do lock all, unlock all, or you want to individually deactivate a user, you could do a individual lock and unlock as well. And there is also options for force password reset, which will force the user to kind of reset their password during their next login attempt. So let's move ahead with the feature of tenant hierarchy. So let's spend a bit of time in understanding the concept of tenant hierarchy. We just briefed during the earlier demonstration of assigned modules and assignable modules. But in real times, tenant hierarchy is a generic concept. It's basically creating a tree kind of structure where you can have a parent tenant, and then it can have a child, and child can have further child. Now this is very generic, but then how do you apply it in a real world scenario? How all are the various mechanisms or manners in which you can make use of them? So there are some common terminologies used to represent this thing. One is the basic tenant model. This is the simplest version. So you have one parent company. So this is the company that is offering the product. Say this is the ISV. So Microsoft is the product admin tenant, and it can have a set of tenants. So it's like a flat hierarchy. So you just have one parent or super tenant, and then you have a series of child tenants, and each child tenant is going to have a set of users. The simplest form of it. The other form could be you can have the parent company, which is the accounting software admin, say, can have two things like Best Buy US and Best Buy Canada. Right? So Best Buy US in turn can have something like Best Buy Seattle and Best Buy New Jersey. So if you look at, interestingly, in this picture, we are treating each location as a tenant, but it need not be that case. You could treat anything, any logical group can be treated as a tenant. So it could either be your geographic location, or it could be, say, within a department within a given company also. So you could, for example, create Best Buy Sales as one tenant, Best Buy R&D as one tenant, right? It's very much possible. So how do you envision what should be created as a tenant? That is a kind of slightly an architecture decision which has to be thought and taken. But then the tenant hierarchy supports anything to be represented as a tenant, and you can have all the settings and mechanisms applied on it. So this basically goes to nth level. You can have any number of child tenants being created. Now this is another interesting one where it represents a reseller kind of a model. So typically what happens is you may have one ISV product admin in place, and then you may have resellers either operating at any level within the tree. So in this case, it could be the next level. For example, the Anna University can also be a reseller, or it could be the college within the Anna University could also act as a reseller, in which case the college may push this product to the students, if it's a student management system or if it's like a e-learning system kind of a thing. The college can act as a reseller in taking it to the students. Alternatively, if it is say a college administration system, then the university can act as a reseller towards pushing it to the colleges. So in the reseller model, the only difference is the reseller itself is not going to use the product. It's basically he is selling the product, but he should have the control and mechanisms to create the right kind of configurations, pull out things, switch off users, control things. So the reseller should have kind of almost all the features that are available to a product admin, except that he can play around only with the set of tenants that belongs to them. So that's how the reseller model kind of works. Virtual tenant is another interesting way of utilizing the tenant hierarchy. Many times what happens is you want to create something called the categories. We saw something called the setting templates, where you can define a set of attributes of a tenant. But what if you want to constitute an entire tenant related settings? Like for example, you may create a set of workflow, you may create a set of custom fields for a tenant. There are so many things that can be defined against a particular tenant. Now, what I could probably do is, I might take one set of category of tenants. Say I'm going to serve a hospital management software, and I know that it's going to be all the hospitals in Washington are going to follow a certain way of operating the software. What I can do is to create a tenant with virtually no users in it. It's just going to be a tenant admin in it. But then I can go ahead and define all these various attributes, including the workflow, custom fields, extended fields, and other settings, business rules. Everything can be defined. And when I create tenants for the hospitals in Washington, I will be creating it under this virtual tenant indicating the Washington. So what it allows me is to inherently use the inheritance concept to bring down all the settings from this particular virtual tenant to all the tenants that are created under the virtual tenant. So again, kind of leverages the inheritance concept and saving a lot of time and less error prone in nature. So that's on the tenant hierarchy front, and there is also interestingly another feature which comes into picture when we talk about the tenant hierarchy. That is the ability to be able to share a user between tenants. Because so far what we have seen, the tenant itself becoming a hard boundary. Right? So if you have a user, that user belongs to a particular tenant. Or the maximum we saw was a user who has access, which is tenant stratification. He has an access to a set of tenants, then he can go into that particular tenant and then he can use those functionalities, use those data. But then what if randomly in the tree, one user belonging to a particular tenant has to be connected to altogether a different tenant, regardless of where the tenant is in the tree, should be able to associate or should be able to share this user. Now, this pretty much happens in consumer kind of cases where the users may not be aware that there are so many other tenants existing in the first place. So you don't want the consumer to log in into each tenant separately. For example, if you're using like iMint point kind of credit system. So this product might be used by several brands. It could be used by Samsung, it could be used by Apple. But when I buy products from both of these people, I would like to do a single login and view all the history of my purchases. While these two companies can act as two different tenants within the system, from a user perspective, it is immaterial to me, and I want to have a single point of view of all my transactions. So that's a scenario where the user linking or user sharing becomes a very handy feature. We'll look into this in a later point in time, but just for your information, we just share that. So let's go ahead and see a quick demonstration of how this user tenant hierarchy can be created using this SaaS framework. So I'm logging into the Pepsi Global, which I created just now, some time back. Now once I'm in Pepsi Global, I'm going to go and create a couple of child tenants. And then we can see how these tenant hierarchies shape up. So this is the tenant management screen. And as you can see in the top, I have logged in as the admin Pepsi Global. I'm creating a tenant, Pepsi US. So here I'm just going to replicate the first model we saw, which is the simple n-level hierarchy creation. Just entering some basic details here. And this URL also can represent a subdomain kind of a thing. That way, when this tenant comes through the subdomain, we will not be asking for company code. Right now, if you have seen in the login screen, we ask for company code. That can be avoided through this subdomain naming convention. So as we create this, let's also ensure that we have a package created in the first place. So, because the package that we saw earlier, standard package, the premium package was created by the product admin. But now Pepsi Global, when they create this child tenant, they should be able to define a package and they have to provide that package to the child that they will create. So here we have selected all from assign package and we have selected a few from the assignable features, assignable package modules. Let's go ahead and finish this creation. And we'll remove some more, and that way we can clearly see that the child gets only very few. So data backup, phone support, and chat are the three things I'm giving as modules which my child can give it to its own child. So now let's go ahead and quickly do the same process again. Let's create the Pepsi US. So while we are at it, we could also try to understand another feature as part of the tenant hierarchy, which is the child tenant approval feature. So many times what happens when your tenant is trying to create a child tenant, you may want the parent tenant. So you have, let's say you have A is a tenant, A has created B, and B is trying to create C. Now, in this scenario, you may want the C creation to be approved by A. That way, A has a control of what their childs are doing. Otherwise, B can create C and B can create so many other things. So you may not have control. You may lose control of it. So a child tenant approval is a feature that will control this particular approval. Either you can have an auto approval, which means A has given an auto approval, which means B, if they create a tenant, let it go and get approved automatically. Or you could set a control stating that A should explicitly agree and approve the creation of C by B tenant. So that's another mode of working. So we'll look at that feature also. So we have created with the first tenant, Pepsi US. And so here we are seeing this message. This tenant is waiting for parent tenant approval. So which means Pepsi Global has created a child Pepsi US, but then that child is not active. It has to be approved by the parent of Pepsi Global, which is the product admin. So let's try logging as Pepsi US and see what happens. We're getting a message, the user does not have any active roles because it's not approved. It's kind of giving an error. Now let's go in as the product admin, which is the company, the ISV, and there is a screen for approving these kind of tenant creations. So tenant management, approve child tenants. And you could see a list of tenant codes there which have already come for approval. So here we see the first line item, Pepsi US, which is created by parent tenant name Pepsi Global, and the approval status is waiting for approval. And I see the buttons approve and reject. So now I have the control to decide if I should approve this creation or I should just reject it. Now just approved it. Now we can try logging in. Okay, so we have now logged in as the tenant admin of Pepsi US. And we are seeing some of these modules won't support at all missing because those modules are not available for this particular user. We can try probably creating another tenant, and we can see what this particular tenant, child tenant, can offer or can provide to its next level of tenant. Because we selected only 3 items as assignable modules. So when we go and try creating a package itself, we should see that take into effect. So there we go. You can see that the assigned modules and assignable modules show up only the 3 items which we selected while creating this particular package for the Pepsi US tenant. So further on, Pepsi US can queue only out of these 3 some of the things or all of these things to the next level, and further on it's going to keep cutting down. So that way you have control of who has what level of access. Now let's go ahead and find out how to set the auto approval. Because earlier we saw we created Pepsi US and then it went for an approval. But let's say Pepsi Global has requested not to have this kind of model. Instead, they should be able to create the tenants by themselves and no need of any approval mechanism. So let's go ahead and change that attribute which controls this particular functionality. So here I have already created a set of templates, and I have something called an auto tenant approval template. And we can see this template has only one attribute which says auto approval for tenant creation, attribute name, and the attribute value is enabled. So what this means basically, when a tenant is associated with this particular setting template, then they inherit this attribute of doing an auto approval of child tenant creation. So let's go ahead and create another child tenant now. We'll again log in as Pepsi Global. So Pepsi Global already has one child, Pepsi US, which went for an approval. Now let's try creating another tenant. Let's create Pepsi China. So this time we have given that setting template, and we mapped that setting template with auto approval enabled in it. So when I, at the end of this submission, it should automatically approve this child tenant, and I should be able to instantly log into this child tenant. So here we get a message, tenant approved automatically. So we just saw an example of one of the attributes from the setting templates, and we saw how it can change the behavior, alter the behavior of how your tenants are going to operate. And like this, there are so many attributes we saw. The page has so many attributes, each having its own impact on how the system is going to function or behave. So it's up to the tenants to determine what those values should be for those attributes and how they want it to function. So let's go ahead and try logging in as the Pepsi China. So I'm able to log in successfully, and I'm able to access the same set of modules. Then for the next feature, let's take a look at how the framework allows to provide varying levels of security at an entity level. So obviously a product is going to deal with a lot of entities. The entity could be the business entities that you deal with. So in this case it could be like a customer, employee, and so many other business functionalities, invoice. It depends on the functionality that you are building. If it's a hospital management system, it could be patient, reservation. So all those entities are available. But how do we control the access of these entities by tenant? So this is a page which helps you to manage the entity tenant scope. And let's take a look at the drop-down values for a moment. So all these has drop-down values, and it has 4 values. One is the default tenant scope, which represents the scope within that particular tenant. The other one represents child tenants, which means, let's take an example of customer entity, and I'm under the view tenant scope. So there are 2 dimensions here to understand. One from an entity dimension, which is customer, and then there is another dimension of what operation are you trying to do. Is it a view operation, edit operation, delete? So we are under the view operation. So for a customer entity, from a viewing perspective, if I select child tenants, then this particular user, this particular tenant can view all the data of the child tenants. all the data of customer entity belonging to their child. So earlier we saw Pepsi, US, Pepsi, China, right? So if I am setting this as child tenants, if I am at the Pepsi Global, I will still be able to see the data of the customers added by Pepsi US and Pepsi China. So this control can be altered just by coming and setting this particular setting of tenant scope. Similarly, you have immediate child tenants. So what that means is, if I have n level of, say, hierarchy, then immediate child tenants means I can see the data of my next level of tenants. But beyond that, I will not be able to see. Again, when it comes to reseller model, this becomes handy because if you have multiple resellers, you may want to see your reseller's data, but not the data of the subsequent reseller. So that is one option. And you can also have a provision of selective tenants, which basically means you can break the tree and then you can pick and choose what kind of data you want to see. So this again is useful when you do services kind of product, where you want to have one particular tenant or users of a tenant being able to view a group of tenants' data, where the tenants may not have any connection between them at all. They could be just across the tree anywhere without any logical connection at all. So that's the entity scope. There is also something called the privilege scope. So similarly, at privilege level, I can say for a given role, I can pick an entity and I can say whether this role can view that entity, added, edited, deleted. So all of that is possible. So you can already imagine the amount of granularity you are able to get. So one, we saw the tenant level and entity level, how we can achieve the granularity. And then here we are looking at a role level and entity level and how to achieve the granularity. So there is the entire security model of SaaS framework is very exhaustive and comprehensive, and you can achieve any level of granularity of security. And all of this is coming out of the box without any line of code being written by the developers. And it can be easily controlled, tweaked, even by an operational person in case if there is a change that is going to happen tomorrow. And in continuance to that, there is also this field level security which can also come into picture. So similarly, at a role level, I can say this particular field can be visible, or I don't want it to be visible. So if I want it to be visible, then I'm just enabling it. If I want it to be editable, I'm enabling it. So again, I can control the variations depending on which role should see what kind of data. This is particularly useful, say you have a salary field and you don't want anybody else other than the manager role to see that particular field, then you can go ahead and set these view and edit options, which means in case if the viewer happens to be a role different than a manager, then the framework will automatically abstract that data, and what you see out of the layer, the data that's coming out of the layer will be masked with stars. So this is done by the framework, and again developers need not worry about it. So complete access control and privilege control at the field level as well as the entity level. So with that, we will move into the smaller set of features for today's session, that is to deal with the UI themes and the globalization support that the framework brings in. I'm going ahead and creating template. There's a template called skin config which has a set of attributes in it. If you look at one of the attributes of the setting template itself is a theme, and the theme can be defined by the developers as well. Basically, the complete presentation layer is available for editing, and the developers can feel free to modify it. So you could create different setting templates with different themes, logos, and other attributes. So that's on the themes front. The themes itself is available in the form of the CSS, so you can always go ahead and change it. We'll take a look at globalization. So globalization, as we all know, is kind of becoming one of the basic features for a product, particularly when you want to take a product to world market. And there's two pieces. One is the globalization itself, and the other piece is the localization. So globalization is basically the provision to be able to handle multiple locations. So the CSS framework is completely globalized, which means there are no text hard codings, or there are no locale-specific hard codings. It's all read from a local config file. So at any point in time, you can go ahead and change the locale to a different setting. For example, here we have language as one of the attributes, and right now we have done it for Hindi and English. So you can go ahead and apply the Hindi language to it, and you could see that the text has changed to Hindi across the product. And of course, you see some of the text which you have deliberately left out. That way, we can know the difference. So we have left out the resource config for those particular text. We have not given any values for the Hindi locale. So that's why you still see them as English. So that you could also go ahead and change the logos. The theme as well. So there we see is a logo of Pepsi itself, and then the theme also got changed to orange theme. From the default theme, it has changed to an orange theme. And again, there are so many attributes that are part of the settings, template settings, that can, as I told, can exhibit different behaviors across the product, that can help you ease out a lot of effort, which otherwise developers will have to put in to build these functionalities. So with that, we will close today's session. And I hope you found it useful. We'll again meet you in a different session where we go through some of the advanced features of SaaS, like business rules, workflow, and ad hoc query and report builder. Once again, thank you for joining this session. Bye.